I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Aaron James, professor and chair of the Department of Philosophy at UCI. Dr. James is a best-selling author and has written many books, including Assholes, a Theory, Surfing with Sartre, and Money from Nothing. So, Dr. James, welcome to the program.
Thanks. Really great to be with you.
So let's start with the books you've written. Please give us a brief description and background, and why did you write them?
Yeah, thanks. I guess my backdrop is those are the ones you mentioned are popular books for a popular audience with commercial presses, and that's not what I do for a living normally. As a professor, and I write a lot of academic and have academic projects. But one thing I've started doing is sort of trying to use philosophical tools to understand and explicate things that are sort of you can't really focus on in academia or write about in a certain way, and then use the philosophical tools to elucidate, put your finger on things that are otherwise sort of undefined that lead to deeper philosophical questions. So the first experience of that was putting my finger on the asshole, as it were. I mean, from encounters I'd had through surfing and through university life and stuff like that, starting to have the sense that, wait a minute, assholes, that's a type of person, and I can use the philosophical tools of definition to define the asshole, and then given that work on questions of moral and political philosophy. So that's that book. Then similarly, in a later book about surfing and philosophy, I tried to define what the surfer knows and knowing how to wave, the kind of attunement they know to the natural world, adaptive attunement, as I call it, and what that reflects about meaning in life and the future of society and leisure and such. And then finally, a book called Money from Nothing is about the nature of money and how the thing that's hard to nail down about it is that it's essentially a kind of promise and tied to promissory credibility. And banking is about managing promises, and how this is tied with our social contract in a deep way. So trying to demystify money by explaining it as a kind of promise. Take something that the alchemy of finance and turning into something, the ordinary reality of promises, and making that clear. So those are some central themes, but that's the general thrust.
Now, this podcast discusses the implications of artificial intelligence. And I often ask my guests if they were following up with this technology prior to the release of ChatGPT, and if you were surprised or impressed by these models. So what were your first impressions?
Yeah, my first impressions of ChatGPT were, like everyone else, just sort of amazed at how, sort of lucid it sounded, and how well it could distill, stuff from the internet. I mean, I had followed large language model, like some of the large language model development and deep learning connection. That some of that comes up in connection with philosophy of mind, and followed some of those debates. And I'd sort of and had a dog in some of those fights, as it were, philosophically, but was fairly skeptical about how well, it was sort of impressed by some of the successes of deep learning. But then by the time they got to ChatGPT, and it was really spitting back sort of fairly conversational, pretty high quality text. That's it was it's an amazing technology. So I think it's really a big step. I mean, at every stage at which you sort of guess about the limits, they get exceeded pretty quickly. So you don't want to bet against it so much, although I still have, caveats about how still skepticism residually about what it can be.
So your colleague, Dr. Duncan Pritchard, on the show was very skeptical about ChatGPT or similar services, and he said that they don't know. They are not in the realm of knowing. They're just predictive models. And there are other people that believe that we are on an exponential curve of intelligence, and this is real. And Ray Kurzweil, a famous author, describes it as an intelligence singularity, where it's kind of like a black hole. So do you believe we're heading into that situation, or this is science fiction?
Yeah, I'm skeptical there too. I mean, the thing is, it's really good at large language models are really good at a specific things, that is making predictions based on vast training data, the whole internet, like vast data sets. It can sort of tease out what's relevant. That's the really fascinating part. And then it can crank out, predictions about basically what's the next word is likely to appear given a previous set of words. Now, that's just what's amazing is how well that technology can work in replicating a kind of a simulacrum of human language use, right? So that's the amazing thing. But that trick, as it were, works only given vast training data, for example. And so that has a lot of applications that I assume are still yet really undeveloped or unexplored that can have big implications. But to me, I guess like Duncan, I'm skeptical about, and I think that is a kind of intelligence. You can attribute a kind of intelligence, a kind of behavioristic sense, but I wouldn't say that's a kind of knowledge or is in a general. And a way of getting at that in connection maybe with the surfing theme earlier is you can think of knowledge in the first instance as not just as a skillful activity that's inherently embodied and embedded in a situation and in a kind of environment. Unlike know-how, knowing how to adapt to the world and attune to the world is a basic way of knowing. And embodied, embedded, attuned, and then are forms of sort of intellectual thought, forms of knowledge that are sort of a piece with that in various ways. And reason and a lot of sort of methods of thought and judgment are sort of part of that attuning. But they're when you strip them away from an embodied embedded environment or our social ways of reasoning together and gathering information, that's a much different rarefied thing. It's not real knowledge, but it's a kind of replication of one of the tools or some aspects of what we do when we know that when in the computer context can produce sort of similar results. But is it really knowledge? Is it the real sort of McCoy, as it were? I mean, it's very different from sort of the paradigmatically human form of knowing or ways of knowing things. And so the question is, how close is it, as an analogy, if it succeeds in replicating a lot of it, should we just call it knowledge or knowing? And I don't know, I still think it's a stretch to say that, but it does seem to have a kind of behavioristic intelligence in a certain kind of thing. That thin sort of concept does seem applicable, but not in the fuller human sense.
Right. But why? Why is not in the full human sense?
Just not similar enough. I mean, it's not similar enough to what it is for a human to know how to ride a bicycle, for example. I mean, like an embodied and know-how that's attuned to the dynamics between weight shift and body shift. Now, you can take a computer just running an algorithm is just like, a box. It's just hardware and software cranking out outputs, it's just doing a very specific type of thing. It's not like a fish swimming through the sea, or an animal roaming around land, knowing how to get around, or a human riding a bicycle, or a human solving an ordinary, like tying a knot or solving a problem. I mean, you can get a robot to replicate some of those things by replicating some of the body dynamics of a body put in an environment, and then you can sort of stick a computer in its quote head, right? And so you can replicate some of these things, but then that's just still like it's a simulacrum. I mean, it's a replication. I mean, here's a way of thinking about it. If you teach a computer in a robot body how to ride a bicycle, have you figured out how what it is for a human to ride a bicycle? I mean, not necessarily. You haven't per se. I mean, you've simulated it. I mean, right? But similarly, you can simulate a world in a virtual space, and someone can put it in a VR glasses, and someone can be totally convinced by it. It could simulate experience of the material world, like Descartes' dreaming hypothesis, such that you couldn't tell the difference whether you're on or off the virtual experience machine. But does that mean that the real embodied, embedded world is just no different? The thing when you're in the world, going about your day, playing with your children, throwing a frisbee at the beach, taking a walk, sipping coffee, like that's still just the same thing as the VR, simulacrum. No, I mean, you might say, no, they're just really different things in a lot of respects. I mean, one is we don't know what we know on the machine versus off in real life. We're not attuned to the world in the way we on a machine than we are in real life. We're also maybe not as happy. This is a little more controversial. We're not as happy, on the machine just because you think your life's going well. Doesn't, running a marathon on virtual space or whatever, doesn't mean you actually are successfully winning a marathon. You're just dreaming about it, or you're not actually. You could virtually dream about surfing a wave, but that doesn't mean you're actually surfing a wave. You're not attuned to the world, engaged in the world, connected to larger things. In the ocean, wet. Just because you're in a lazy boy with VR goggles, having a super realistic experience. So there's real differences between these things, even if there's a lot of similarities, even if there's a similar outcome. And so that's the kind of question that's really at issue. Even if you get something that replicates a machine that replicates human somethings really well, there's a question of how similar it is, or what we can learn from it, how much you can learn from it. Yeah, so there's still that deeper question, I think, is still wide open, even if it successfully manipulates language manipulation at a certain level of sophistication. It's good enough to impress my students in my courses, and that's why they're tempted to plagiarize it in answering their test questions. But if you read the ChatGPT answers to your exam questions, for example, it's not convincing as like a decent, thoughtful human answer to the question. Someone who read the text, followed the material in class. It's pretty easy for me or TAs to kind of guess what's just ChatGPT boilerplate, and what's a student actually thinking through the problems and writing about it. You can still discriminate that, as impressive as the AI is in generating text.
So, in the context of your book, Assholes, a Theory, we've seen a rise of a lot of online toxicity in the recent years. And now that AI is kind of mediating our information, whether inbound via the algorithms of social media dictating what we get exposed to, or outbound, where AI is now writing our emails or writing our posts on social media, or even the messages that we send to our friends and colleagues. So what implications do you think that this will have on people's behavior online?
Yeah, I think that the context that it creates can bring out the worst in us and make bad behavior more visible to everyone, and then feel like people have more of a license to be a lesser version of themselves. So, one way to think about how this can work in the online context is sort of just like the way cars make you more of an asshole than you might be if you're just walking around in foot traffic, having to encounter people, just think about a city foot traffic, people having to walk, pass on opposite sides of a sidewalk, for example. It's a very intricate kind of coordination, this delicate anticipation that we expect of each other so we can just all smoothly go about our day. Somebody who stepped in your line of way, it would be pretty, it doesn't happen that often because people are very attuned to each other. And if somebody were really just to walk straight and not make any accommodation of the others, just cruise along and expect everyone to get out of the way, people would get enraged, like, hey, this asshole, hey, everybody's got to do their part. You got to adapt a little bit, get on the side. Even if the flow roughly goes on opposite sides of the sidewalk, people will be pretty careful about that. We're very used to that. People will take offense really quickly. They'll very quickly police infractions. If somebody was sort of drawing a line, not accommodating, other people's would rally. Hey, guy, think of New York or whatever. Say, hey, asshole, a New Yorker calling somebody out. Like, New Yorkers are highly cooperative and they police assholery, like, hey, asshole, to the point of being called assholes for doing that. But I think it's part of the hum of cooperation that is New York City. Okay, now compare the car in Southern California. We're not as acquainted to foot traffic. People are driving. There's still this intricate coordination, but because it's an anonymous context, there's a technological difference. We don't have the face-to-face encounter with others. We're basically driving around in these steel boxes. You kind of can't tell who's in the car, other than seeing the sort of dim shape of the head. There's no hand signals for apology, even. Like, maybe it could be this, but I don't know, that's ambiguous. There's no hand signal for apology, but there is a hand signal for offense, for taking objection. And so as a result, people, drive much more aggressively, and they're much less accountable to others in their driving as a result. You know, they're more worried about whether they'll get caught, get a ticket or something, and less worried about whether they're going to, how cooperatively they're driving. They're fine to just speed along, veer in and out of traffic, or, you know, be hostile to slow lane drivers like me or whatever, you know. So the anonymity and sort of relatively sheltered kind of technological environment takes us away from the embodied, embedded, social, human kind of attunement and accountability that we have towards each other. So now let's think of that as a little bit of a model for what happens when we go online. Now it's supercharged anonymity, because you can not only be you can be totally anonymous. You can have an avatar. There's no name present, not even a picture, no trace that somebody could track you down to get, or it'd be very difficult anyway to get to your real identity. And then, you know, you can kind of sort of be virtually anyone you want, any persona you want to adopt, you can be. Even people where they have their names attached, you know, might feel like there's not going to be a lot of immediate blowback or accountability or reputational effects or consequences for their misbehavior. And so they can kind of just, you know, say that whatever stupid thing comes to their mind, you know, without moderating, you know, or even just like people are sitting in their house in front of their computer or on their phone doing something else. They don't, and they're, you know, like, oh, it's just a post on a chain, and all I'm doing is saying my snide, silly remark that whatever, you know, thing that came to my head for the moment, you know, kind of just impulsively, without thinking like, oh, this is a conversation with other people, where the normal, if you're in a face-to-face interaction, your normal sense of like how a person is going to react, look at you, sneer at you, you know, you're going to get that immediate feedback, which you don't get in the immediate context. And then similarly, when people respond to somebody's comment online, a thoughtless, spur of the moment comment, or kind of off the cuff, you know, insensitive comment, then they don't think, well, gee, what's a gentle way of correcting this person to getting them to kind of see that there's a more cooperative, productive way of engaging. What they do is, you know, pile on and dunk on them and, like, you know, rally together to sort of, you know, put, virtue signal to each other about how they can put this other person in line or whatever, you know, like, so those dynamics happen very easily because of the sort of disembodied, disengaged form of environment. So like we can learn, it can do better. Some contexts are a more kind of civil form of engagement where people are there for productive encounters, but that has to kind of be understood. The architecture of the platform has to encourage that. The parties involved have to feel like there's a critical mass of good faith participants. And then even when that exists, it's fragile because a few trolls can come along and degrade the place, or you could have a troller in chief buy the platform, if you know what I'm talking about, and then themselves, you know, just, you know, send out barbs to make sure that, you know, the troll is a, you know, troll control when the troll wants, you know, like, so, and people who want good faith discussion, you know, have to like reckon with the troll. So I mean, this kind of thing, it's a much more fragile, even where people are kind of adapting to try to replicate good faith, you know, productive, ordinary conversational environment. It's still a fragile situation and easily degraded. And then this can be fixed by the good architecture. Platform architecture can really encourage that. But then the platforms themselves are conflicted. They have market reasons to create those environments, but also market reasons not to sort of, you know, just amplify engagement for ad revenue, for, you know, for example. So they're, depending on their business model, it's conflicted on how well they want the thing to work for purposes of discussion or for purposes of keeping people's eyeballs glued to the platform so they can sell them ads and then get revenue from that. So it's a very fraught, mixed model for, you know, entrusting the platforms with basically the basic architecture for public discourse in a democracy. If the whole thing's supposed to run, you know, on some kind of productive discussion among the citizenry and in the public, among the important issues, you know, we now are at a little bit of a crisis because we don't really have a good media architecture and sort of culture and free speech culture of cooperative, you know, speech that really facilitates that. And there's no obvious way forward. So sorry, I laugh about it but it's really awful. Yeah.
You've written extensively on political philosophy, and now that we have a presidential elections coming up, And with the rise of deep fakes, I'm sure you've seen deep fake of the Pope and many others. And this generative AI is kind of helping in spreading misinformation, disinformation campaigns. How do you see the implications of this playing out in the coming elections?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one concept useful here is just it's been analyzed philosophically is just the concept of bullshit, and the sort of its political importance. Where you can think of bullshit as a kind of, as Harry Frankfurt defines it, as a kind of fakery. It's inherently fakery. It's something that's it's a kind of thing that presents itself as one thing, where that pretense carries standards of quality of a certain kind. But then the thing that the thing actually is just, it doesn't measure up by those standards. It's a kind of fake, or, it could be fraudulent, but it's just, there's such a big gap in the standards that it's a fake version of the kind of thing it is. So, for example, a speech is Frankfurt focuses on. So political speech could be, it's presenting something as political speech that people are supposed to take seriously, say, for example, among a politician about decisions, speech that bears on important decisions we're supposed to make as a country that still reflect the character of the country or the weight of, national responsibility and things like that. There's expectations we have for that kind of speech. And then there's somebody who can sort of present a fake version of that, right? Because it has sort of the broad form of it, but then it just doesn't measure up, right? And it's kind of a fake pass off. And so, for example, speaking of the presidential race, Trump is notorious. I mean, he's a notorious bullshitter in the sense that he just says things he presents things as true, or as assertions that have the form of truth, but then he doesn't care whether they're true. He's just saying them for entertainment value, or to be transgressive, or to own his enemies, to please the people who want to see those people owned. Or he'll say things to make him sound smart and look like he's serious about the issues of the country, but he doesn't really care about the issues at all. He's just saying something that sort of passes for like an argument, or, or he's reassuring supporters. So there's a kind of pretense of what he's doing, and then there's the sort of very blatant like disregard of that pretense and a kind of false version of it. So that's the way he traffics in a big way in bullshit. But he's just like one of the greatest bullshitters of all time. Bullshit in the larger culture is still pretty endemic. I mean, the larger media culture is chock full of bullshit. Larger political discourse chock full of bullshit. People speaking without regard for the truth, a kind of fake version of what you should expect. And it's not just political speech. A lot of it is clickbait advertising. It's something that looks like a news headline that's supposed to be informative value, but it's really just to get eyeballs. It's a way of directing traffic. And that's not just headlines. It's whole articles, it's whole platforms, it's whole reviews on Amazon. They're supposed to be informative, but they're maybe constructed by ChatGPT. They can replicate something that has an appearance of something that's with quality, advertising or review, or even a whole website or a whole product for sale, drop ship from China, I mean, it's not really a going business. It's just somebody that set up this thing as a fly by night operation, So this is all bullshit, and it's kind of everywhere, so much so that we like lose our sense of what is bullshit and isn't bullshit. The worry is that there's so much bullshit when we stop expecting the promise of quality in the first place. We don't expect truth anymore. We don't expect responsible political speech anymore. We don't expect truth in advertising anymore. We don't expect responsible businesses to actually try to devise products that are going to be valuable for people, and that's why you will buy it. Things like that. People with real mission-oriented companies, or politicians who actually want to do things in the public interest. There can be enough bullshit so that we drive out our expectations, and it's all just like a big bullshit ad campaign where, like, in certain advertising, you just know it's an ad and you don't expect it to give truth. I mean, even as an ad, it can be a bullshit ad. Like, it's not even a good ad. It's supposed to be an ad. It's just a fake version of an ad. So you could say this is a bullshit ad. But this can be such a big problem that it's partly because our media environment is so congenial to so much of this that we're just kind of at sea and unable to sift through it, right? And so that gives a kind of a premium on clarity. So if algorithms can give us something like a search engine that can sift through the bullshit to some degree, or some kind of chat GPT reconstruction or whatever, we're like, oh, good, at least a little bit of clarity sifting through the fire hose of bullshit we're constantly confronted. Or a politician that can come up with a simple narrative, like you're aggrieved, you're a victim, I'm the answer, there's no alternative. Just like that simple narrative, very clear, can help people feel like, okay, I can hang my hat on that. I can be oriented by that. I can feel like I understand. And now, okay, I trust you. And now just to I don't know, make America great again, the true American values or whatever, reinforce those against this corrupted, pile of crap culture that, that our great, countries become or whatever. So that you can see why that becomes an attractive message. But it's also why certain companies like AI platforms, by just organizing information, using technology, why they can command a premium on our attention, because they get like some semblance of clarity and sort of control and orientation for navigating this complicated environment. So yeah, but then the result is they have a lot of power over the environment. The way that they set up the architectures, again with mixed motives, is the way I was talking about. But then they may or may not be responsible to sort of fulfill the needs of the larger public culture and commons that are needed for the republic. So that's going back to the other point I mentioned. And so journalism hasn't caught up with how to manage that environment either and fulfill its traditional responsibilities, especially around presidential elections. It still hasn't figured out how to manage the competing agendas using the information and misinformation environment. I mean, it's the professional journalism is much sort of captured and distorted, or at least influenced by that environment, and still doing heroic efforts to try to overcome it. But I don't think that they've figured out. So we'll see anyway. We'll see how it goes. If it's any better than last time around, it's hard to know. But we're still at the stage, I think, where the technological shock to the system is. We haven't really got ahead of it. I mean, every big technological shock comes with cultural and political upheaval that it takes a lot of time to sort of come around on. Not always with everything coming back to where it was, and so we're still in this transitional period. And I think literally the republic is at stake, and whether we can figure it out soon enough. But yeah, anyway.
Keeping with politics, do you think that since we are already in an AI race or in technological race between countries, especially China versus the US in terms of this particular technology, but there's also other technological races that's happening, especially in quantum computing. Do you think access to such advanced technologies and using them for decision making in governments could be something beneficial to humanity, or could be on the contrary?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the really scary thing about a lot of the AI or the new technologies, it's not so much the singularity, like robots becoming super intelligent and taking over the world. I think it's AIs or other technologies, letting humans, people with bad intentions, bad actors, far more powerful in doing things that they're already trying to do to gain power, corrupt environment. And now a lot of these are just government sponsored, not only they're like governments using these things or sponsoring, say AI innovators or platform pioneers to do these, or research scientists. In that sense, it's part of an older story, the same story that gave rise to the nuclear power. And then look at did that do a lot of good for the world? That unleashed hell upon the world. And, it's, a defining feature of the second half of the 20th century has been the gradual attempt to have to manage the threat of that kind of technology still falling in the wrong hands. I mean, it's still a really important issue. So that's a kind of world historical kind of safety, technological management issue that I think does come up with any big technology like this where it can be used for political power and advantage for purposes of domination. I mean, it will by certain actors. It will be deployed for those purposes, and then the question is how the more competitive forces are going to going to rein it in, and what kinds of, and then, governments are both the source of that problem, and then the answer, and then, if they can pull it together, which is doesn't always go well, or it takes, or only works after, after wars and catastrophes and other really awful things have happened. So, I mean, if the question is whether that kind of stuff is in the cards with the new developments, it's absolutely in the cards. Yeah, I mean, it's always been in the cards, and every big new technology raises those kinds of profound risks. I mean, I think it's naive to just expect otherwise, I mean, just like it's naive to go, for a long time without pandemic and think that the long history of wars and pandemics is suddenly over, and that we're not going to get another pandemic, and it's only, and what you can hope is that what we've learned about how to manage pandemics from the past could be used proactively to sort of get ahead of them, and then mitigate the risks early on before pandemics get out of control, or between AI or technological safety issues get out of control. You can hope for that kind of sort of precautionary management on the part of government, because it has learned to do that on lots of different areas. And that is what government should definitely be doing. And firms definitely have responsibility to do that themselves. But so you can hope that's definitely a feasible kind of thing, right? So, and that is the responsibility of government and the firms. But then whether they'll actually pull it off in the new case is, I mean, there's no do-over. We're doing history, and things often don't go well. And, I think we should, go forward with that kind of recognition about the fragility of history, and that should inform our sense of public responsibility, certainly at the government level, where there really are a lot of good faith, people trying to stay ahead of these kinds of problems. But it's more conflicted at the level of these private platforms, where there are people that are very brilliant people who are public spirited, but again, as they have conflicted competitive incentives, they want to be the first to get the technology out, so they'll tell those story about how, they're going to, be as transhuman labor transformative technology that's going to do all these benefits, and then maybe not as cautious about the risks. Or in an earlier stage, somewhere like Meta, is going to reshape the information environment. It says, it's gleeful about moving fast and breaking things and just presuming everything is going to work out, and then, are we trying to break democracy? Of course we're not trying to break democracy, but yeah, they can go ahead pursuing engagement at all costs and eyeballs, and, and take control of the media environment, including the political, and then in fact break democracy, so, and then just sort of then when it's, not take responsibility for that. Well, like, who could have known, so they're within the platforms and the culture of Silicon Valley, and sort of the mixed incentives around capitalist class. I think they're just, even well-meaning people, very smart, well-meaning people, can be very conflicted and very prone to rationalization, in a way that doesn't let them see or act on or take seriously their sort of grave public responsibilities. And so I think that just is the world we're living in, and what political entities can do to help them see that is itself a hard question too, because there you have conflicting political agendas and difficulties of regulation, and no clear-cut regulatory answers as well. So I don't have easy answers there, but yeah.
No, that's definitely a great topic for perhaps maybe a full episode on it. It's quite impressive and quite interesting. Now, switching to the meaning of life. So you've written Surfing with Sartre, and you've tackled the meaning of life in quite an interesting way with the analogy of surfing. Now, the fact that humans have certain cognitive capacity, or like we have limitations to things that we really don't understand in the world. And considering we are building these intelligence systems, these artificial intelligence, and if the predictions are right, we are heading into a artificial superintelligence where these systems will exceed human intelligence. Do you think that will open up a new realm of understanding of meaning of life and purpose and consciousness and whatnot?
No, I think that's a grotesque dystopian scenario in which the real meaning of life has been drained out of it. To be honest, let me say something more a little less reckless, but to justify that that claim. I mean, start with the idea of surfing and thinking about. I mean, surfing and I think is an inherently very richly meaningful activity in life, and what's meaningful about it is that it's an embodied, embedded, attuned, naturally adaptive way of adapting to the world beyond, and kind of union and being part of it, and engaged in it. There's a kind of inherent intrinsic meaning, a sense in which, for being engaged in this way with the waves naturally adapting, part of the larger things, the ocean and the sky and the tides and the you know. There's a way in which you're doing something that's just clearly worthy of doing for its own sake, something for which the surfer, in doing it, is just glad to be alive rather than not. I mean, why be alive rather than not? If that's the existential question, why keep living or not? This is an answer. This is, well, I'm glad to be here for this. Like, whatever else happens, this is meaning. This is meaning. Now, you can have that. Surfers have that in spades, but you can also have it just in a great conversation with friends, or time spent with friends, or a great relationship, or a wonderful intellectually engaging discussion, or being swept up in a good book, or even the social flow of the people passing each other on a sidewalk, being part of the hum of a city. That's social attunement. This is all inherently meaning. This is all inherently worthwhile for its own sake. Part of why it's good to be alive rather than not. Why life is being lived, should be lived, can be lived rather than not. And why we shouldn't all just chuck it in and end civilization or commit suicide or whatever. Why you should keep going is just to keep doing these things for their own sake, right? So that's kind of the surfer answer about meaning of life. But I think it leads out, and that does already reflect part of the limitations on what sort of computers or robots have that kind of thing. They're not embedded in the same way. They're the simulation of it. But is it mimicry? Is it just parroting, or is it the real thing? That's the earlier question we mentioned earlier. But now let me give you another point about the future. So one thing that's valuable about this inherent embedded meaning is it doesn't necessarily involve its meaning without a bigger story. It doesn't have to be a big story except what I'm doing right now, or this afternoon, this day, or whatever. It doesn't have to be, definitely not a cosmic story of all human history, but not even a story of like what happened this week or this year or in my 40s or during my midlife or whatever, let alone how to make sense of my whole life at the end of it, or the meaning of life or something like that. But I do think that there's the stories that we tell about the different events and over longer periods, shorter and longer periods, including all of human civilization, is a really important part of meaning as well. I think we put value on the stories that we can tell. What's the best story we can tell to make sense of all the events that occurred? And there are better and worse stories you can tell, and that's important to us existentially, because what story you can tell changes whether we can feel like we can reconcile ourselves to having lived those events, right? Having that been the life that happened to us. And that's true for a personal level. A midlife crisis, you might figure, what am I doing? Well, what's the story I can tell about what I'm doing, or at the end of your life. At midlife, you might anticipate what story you'll be able to tell at the end of your life, such that, what am I doing? Why am I here? Or why am I just not wasting my time? What is just getting money, trying to get rich, money or fame or whatever. This isn't what matters. What's a meaningful life? What story makes a better story about the life you will have lived at the end of your life that you could now live at midlife, as sort of making good on a claim to living well, good, meaningful life. So that matters to us. But the story also works. The story-based view works at the kind of larger level too, about humanity. What's the story of humanity, about what it's been and what it's become? One big story that's common, for example, is the story of progress, the arc of history bending towards justice, to use Martin Luther King's narrative. Or it could be the progress of Adam Smith's, the progress of civilization, advancement of the wealth of nations, and gradual accumulation of wealth and prosperity and material well-being, and time for leisure and enjoyment, and arts and industry and such. That's the story of progress. These are narratives, right, that sort of give meaning. So the idea is and filling out what would be a meaningful way for the future to continue of humanity. Well, it's more progress or more justice or whatever, like that. Okay, so that's a story that can kind of be redemptive in a sense of like the question, like, why are we all here? Why do we care whether humanity continues or not? Why don't we just end it all? Why aren't we happy if a meteor comes and ends it all, or if climate change, basically brings it to an end in short order or something like that, some catastrophe? Should we regret that or not? Well, we might think, well, that's a terrible story. That's a bad story. That's not like, we can't live with it, like reconcile ourselves to our lives, our parents, our children's lives, everyone we know and love, everything we've ever known and loved. Like, that's what it comes to. Just a meteor hits it and it's all over. That's it. That's a terrible story. We go the way of the dinosaurs. That's not the meaningful human existence. We want something like a better story, right? Okay. So here now, in that context, let me give you what I think of as a terrible story, a terrible way for humankind to go. Human beings gradually, so supercomputers and robots gradually get better and better, and then people, person by person, gradually migrate up, basically start with like augmenting their capacities, with chip implants first, and then, bionic limbs and all this or whatever. And, they live longer and they're smarter and they're better and faster bionic people or whatever. But then they gradually just like, forget these carbon-based bodies and let's just upload ourselves to the internet. Like, and then, now we've got these virtual agents that are sort of doing these intelligent behaviors and operating in the world. And we just, upload humanity to this digital realm. And maybe there's some sense, let's even grant that experientially there's some continuity there, such that you move from your physical bionic self to this digitized avatar. And it feels, in some sense, some kind of consciousness persists or awareness persists in the way that, you still feel like yourself when you're playing a video game, even though you're in the avatar environment, your kind of agency is still expressed. Like, say there's something like that. So I think of that as like a grotesque and terrible story. Basically, what we've done is traded away. If that's the story of humanity, then I think it basically came to an end in a kind of ignominious way. It's like having the meteor hit. I mean, we've just lost all of what's great and beautiful about human life. The surfing, the embedded, the waves, like the beautiful attunement of natural environment, and like the sort of organic relations that have everything else going on. Our participation in that, our taking walks with friends or loved ones in nature, or playing with your kids at a park, a day at the beach, like all these beauties of human life. I mean, none of that's happening if we're just like in this virtual environment. Whatever, even if whatever productivity sticks to your side, in money transactions or whatever. I mean, this is all a travesty of value. To me, this is like a depressing story. It's the end of humanity. It's the end of the world. It's an ignominious end. It's just a terrible story.
Yeah,
If that's
but death is the alternative. So let's say you had a great, fruitful life. You enjoyed surfing. You enjoyed the attunement with nature. And then, people get old, and, in the end of your life, you have much less physical abilities. So now you are faced with two choices: either upload your consciousness into a machine and continue living in that digitized avatar environment, or die. So in that case, I will choose to continue even in an avatar form. No? Wouldn't you?
So I think that's basically a delusion that that there's any way to avoid death. That's just in the cards. Death is we're all gonna die, and and it's better not to fight it. It's like, don't fight it, accept it, and then live well while we're alive. We're not dead now. We're alive now. Let's live. Right now, I want to drag it out, life as long as possible. Like, I'm all into the anti-aging, stuff, and, improving my natural anti-aging capacities and all that stuff. I'm all for that, dragging it out. But like, if I could eke out another decade or 2 decades or even 50 years, that's more time. That's just more time to like learn more things and spend more time at the beach and, have more friendships. It's more of the goods of life is extending it. But the idea that could be anything longer, that there's any kind of transposition of the self from our embodied, embedded physical beings to a virtual version, I think that is a death. I mean, I think that even if there was some kind of continuity of experience that persisted, and I don't necessarily think there would, but even we just grant that hypothetically, I think you basically still did die once. So basically, I don't know, you're on your deathbed and you've got tubes keeping you alive, right? But then you like got a brain chip that's uploading whatever, the kind of whatever architecture, synaptic architecture brain, it's digitizing it, using quantum computing if you want, it's putting that into a quantum computator, and so it's being run on a platform, and now it's like, and now your program is better run on like Google servers, and like wherever they have those, in California. Like, what happens to you, right? Well, I think you're dead. You're dead when once the upload happens, and you're in this like ambiguous, dreamy state, and then they unplug the tubes with the fluids. Well then, clunk. You die. I think, and even if this ghostly form persists off in this internet digital world, I think you're
It's
gone.
not you.
It's not you. It's not you. That's not the same. That even if that's a kind of, I don't even think it really. I'm doubtful it could be a conscious being. But let me just grant that it's a big assumption. Even if there was a conscious virtual agent that now is sort of roaming around the new digital architecture, that's like these other AI agents. It's not you. It's not you. I mean, it might be called your name. There might be a digital avatar associated with all your family pictures. It might still control your Facebook profile, the one you set up as a human. But it's not you. It's not one and the same being. I think the numerically persisting being that's you, that makes you the same being as you were yesterday, the same human person that the person you call your mother, gave birth to, that you is just gone. It ceased to exist. And it's at best this kind of shadowy, ghost-like virtual descendant of it. And now, why do you care about that being persisting? Oh, fine. I mean, I don't know. Do you care about populating the world with 1,000 of those things? And by the way, and this is a deep problem, if you could upload one of yourself, of your quote virtual selves, then you could upload 2 or 10 or 1,000,000. So now if there's 2 of you or 100 of you, digital you, then none of them are you, right? By transitivity identity, because if neither of those are identical to each other, then there's not any one that's identical to you, right? So that's to say, the one that is you, that starts out as you, is just kaput. So Null is gone, and there's just these 2 replicas of you or 100 replicas of you or whatever. Who cares about doing that? Why just be dead? I mean, put it this way. Or sorry, I use that phrase, be dead, but you don't have to worry about being dead, because there is no such thing as being dead. I mean, it's not that you're dead but in a bad state. You are not. There is no you there. Plato pointed this out and drew a different conclusion from it, but it's just, you are no longer, and it won't hurt, it won't suffer. It's like, no one will be, you won't be around for it. You're long gone. There is no you anymore. Or you goes back, what's left of you goes back to the earth and spread around the flowers, and, or back into the ocean, or, on your relatives, mantelpiece, ashes for ashes.
But there are these existential questions still. You mentioned, like, okay, what happens when we die? Do we have a soul? Is there a spirit? Is there God who created the universe? There are some deep existential questions. And the hope is that if we created an advanced, intelligent systems that could help us with these answers. The question here is, do you think that AI would help humanity figure out questions, and what would be the implications of that on religion, for example?
Right. So let me say this. One thing is, so one traditional way of dealing with these existential concerns, like how can I survive the grade, is to say, well, let's see, there's a God, and the God's powerful, and the God's good, and God cares about you and created you, so not so that you would just be dead at physical, death. But there's a you, a soul that's something more than your personality that makes you you, and that's detachable and can continue. And now no one has an explanation for what this actually is. There's whole philosophies, Plato, Descartes, are all have fairly fancy things to say about mind and body, why they're separable metaphysically, and whole metaphysical systems are elaborated around these, partly to give this story about religious or theological story a place to sort of resolve that's different from science. This is Descartes' big finesse, to sort of govern the soul and immortality and stuff like that. All that's to assuage this existential concern, like I don't want to die, like, and why I want to keep going on, and it is that reassurance. But no, aside from that, let me just do this. Grant you, for the sake of argument, that there's a God, we have souls, they can survive the grade, they can carry on in whatever shadowy afterlife God has arranged for this. And by the way, there's not a clear picture of what that is. There's this banquet. I don't know. It's not any cloud. Clouds are physical formations. The banquet involves food. That's a short-term thing. Food's a physical embodied thing. Food in heaven, there's not food. There's a disembodied, immaterial place. We don't have a clear idea what this is going to be like. But let's just say that God in God's goodness has arranged a place where the souls migrate if they're good enough, or if they've got forgiveness or whatever. Okay, grant that for the sake of argument. I don't think that Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, in ramping up these platforms, even if they make them so that we can upload our cognitive architecture to them, are doing God's work in the sense that they're making something can allow us to survive the grade in that sense. I mean, they're not doing God's work in that sense. There's nothing like the equivalent of the thing that traditional, theology might promise in just mere technological developments. I just don't think that's in the cards. I think that's sort of still, that's basically a fantasy. Not the fantasy, it's certainly speculative whether the technology would ever get that good. I'm not betting against that it might not do really amazing things, because probably it will do even more amazing things. But whether it could amount to something that captures the identity of persons, captures human consciousness, allows persons to survive the grave and persist in perpetuity as long as the servers aren't unplugged, that I think is a fantasy. Fantasy in the sense that I think it's not a philosophically well supportable position. That's a conclusion of the argument. You got to argue for that. So this is a short thing, so I'm just giving you my impulse around it. But people do try to defend it, and there's sophisticated arguments to have about it, and that's a cool thing. That's why we have philosophy, But I'm giving you my guess about where the argumentation is going to wind up.
Right. So my last question is kind of in line with that. Is that, because you argue a lot about the meaning of life is to live it, is to be surfing, is to enjoy that moment. And I was wondering if you think that AI is gonna, free us to pursue leisure activities, or is it another phase of rat race where we have all these tools and then we have to run to produce more, and we are like stuck in this vicious circle of capitalism, basically?
Yeah, I think in short, the answer is it's up to us, and it's up to what politics decides to make of it. I think the potential for technology has always displaced labor and made for tremendous labor-saving devices. And then the question is, at every stage of that, there's a question of both, can we quickly find new things to do with our time? Now that we're freed up from doing the earlier things, you don't have to wash your clothes. The washing machine just, that's a massive time-saving device. extremely important in the history of the world. The washing machine, like one of the big ones for material prosperity. But then, and the computers, one of this before AI comes in. All of these things free up our time. Things we previously used human labor on, we do use less of, and now we can do other things. People still have to run the machines and the computers and the washing machines and all that stuff, but more human labor is freed up for other things. And then we have a choice about what we do for whether we use the time to work for money or whether we do other things that are have non-monetary value. And what's the change in technology as it increases it at every stage gives us a choice to potentially work less or change the kind of work that we do, and decide how much it should be work for money versus other forms of reward or other forms of status, even like social contribution and other ways of marking it, the status associated with contributing to others. And I think that we've made good decisions about that in the past. We've made bad decisions. We've also made good decisions. The 40-hour work week in the late 1930s was a good decision along those lines. It was partly made possible, feasible, because of the rise of labor-saving technologies, started coming on and made a 40-hour work feasible. And that's what gave rise to what made like the post-war era of American prosperity good was not just that was unprecedented reduction of poverty, also low inequality, but it wasn't just that people had jobs, good paying jobs, and cradle gave Social Security, or at least white people especially, but more and more brown people and more women had it. It wasn't that, it was also the idea of like the surfer who's got a 40-hour work week, you've got time at the beach, you got enough money so you can, and you got a 40-hour work week so you can spend your time in leisure, spend your time with the family, you can live, you can have prosperity, right? So that did involve a choice to, a lot of that time could have been spent more money or for making money, right? And now gradually we've pulled that back a little bit and spent more time chasing money instead of leisure, or convincing ourselves that meaning is just in work for money or other forms of status like fame or social media attention, likes and stuff like that. And our incentives are pulling us more in that direction. But although the pandemic destabilized work in a certain way and gave people a lot more flexibility with virtual work, this is a fairly liberating thing. And that's still unsettled, but I think it has allowed people to have at least a lot more flexibility to balance work and life in this way. So I think that new AI technologies will once again create those opportunities to sort of rebalance. And, over time, I think the trend is like, it's mixed, but it's good. There's still a good trend of like, are freeing ourselves up for more leisure time. And the possibilities are really there to do it. I mean, and it's especially appealing if you think of leisure as not just sitting around on a day at the beach, which is I love and value, and not just lazing around the house, but also finding new forms of creative activity and skillful expression that are done for rewards, for example, in service of people or artistic accomplishment, or even in forms of business or design or architecture or engineering that might bring you money, or philosophy that might bring you money because you're teaching or you might bring you money, but you're not doing it for the money, you're doing it for its own sake, right? So I think that kind of the more that we're freed up from drudgery and more we're freed up from doing unpleasant things, and that if that can be managed equitably, then the possibilities for expanding and doing more meaningful kinds of work, both for money and not for money, then that sort of expands. And then whether we can seize that instead of being convinced we should just get more money instead, is kind of really just depends on major political choices about how we organize the monetary system and the system of work and the incentives around it. A lot of that's what this book, Money from Nothing, is about. how to make that work, make the sort of monetary and banking architecture for this better, brighter social contract to actually work. That's part of that story.
Yeah, I think part of me doing this podcast is because I really enjoy it. It doesn't pay the bills for sure, but I feel that my best time is when I'm stimulated mentally. And when I'm learning, I think learning is one of my biggest hobbies. So when I do that, I feel great about myself. Now, doesn't pay the bills? No. So I would love to see one day what OpenAI are working on, which is a universal basic income, whereby all the robots and the machines are doing most of the work, and people don't have any more reason to work, or there's no need for them to work, and therefore they are suggesting to hand out people a universal basic income to live by and pursue whatever they want to pursue, and make work a choice. Do you agree with such proposition?
Yeah, in the book Money from Nothing, which I wrote with Bob Hockett, one thing we propose is a way of doing a basic income through the central bank. So the key thing, the idea is like the way the big banks now have accounts at the central bank. Every citizen automatically just gets a bank account at the central bank, and then the central bank just creates the money, just types in the credits like $1,000 or $2,000 a month, and then it can put interest rates on those accounts to influence saving and spending, so you don't get bad inflationary or deflationary trends. And the way that it now influences interest rates on the way banks lend. So the monetary policy can be conducted via a basic income payment through a central bank. So that's one of the big ideas in the book. But here now, how much money can you put in these accounts? How much money can the Fed, for example, just create from nothing? Just type in, how big can this basic income payment be? Well, partly it depends on what tools for inflation management it uses on the money side. But the other side of it is how productive the economy is in the other side, because inflation is a mismatch between the amount of money being spent into an economy and the amounts of goods and services that money is chasing, right? So, and you can have more money flowing into the economy, a higher basic income payment. If you have more goods and services being produced, that's not inflationary. There's a match there. It's only if you get a collapse in goods and services production, then the more money would bid up prices on goods and services, and everybody hates inflation, so we get out of that, right? But if you can find ways to increase productive capacity in goods and services, then you can have more and more, bigger and bigger basic income payments flowing into people's public bank accounts. So how do you do that? Well, one answer is public investment banking, and that's a big thing. That's a traditional thing that we know how it works. It can work. It's not used enough, and we should ramp that out. But if you want to be more adventurous, here's another long-term way that AI can help. As AI makes the people much more productive, as it's just doing a lot of tasks, and it's allow people, even in less time, to be more productive, then you can have a smaller number of people working fewer hours per year or per week, being ever more productive in goods and services. So the total output and productive capacity can be much higher, in which case we can basically afford and pay for a much higher basic income payment. So those two can align really well. And, you have to wait. You can't plan it all at once. You just have to see how productive the AI makes us over time as it gradually increases. But as it does so, people can work less and also get paid more, and the basic income can gradually go up. And as long as you manage that in a balanced way, that's a way that in the long run, we can both have guaranteed free money, ever more of it as a basic income, but also more free, leisure, flexible time as well. And then a key piece of that is, technology, just making us, and AI, especially if the promised, deep learning or machine learning and LLM boom really kicks in and does all kinds of incredibly innovative things. Oh, and by the way, so when there's shocks to the system, if there's mass disruption of industry, which could happen, the basic income payment also helps in a precautionary way. It helps you adapt to that, because then people who are thrown out of work have something to fall back on, and then they can bide their time and get another job or retool their skills in the way the economists tell them they should. But then they have a sort of safety net there to manage those disruptions. So that's a way to make it work as a more productive social contract, is give people that sort of basic income guarantee, so they can manage the transitions that AI, is already starting to reshape various industries. But if there's a big shock to the system that's hard to adapt to, then people can adapt if they have free, sure money coming in their public central bank account.
Dr. James, I want to thank you for your time today, and I look forward to having you again on the show, maybe another time.
Thank you so much.